Coming up on today's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast, there's a lot of officials out there. The Raiders made it official with Josh Jacobs. Derek Carr made it official with another team. Plus, it's official that the veteran pool of quarterbacks is starting to dwindle. We'll talk all about that, plus team needs heading into free agency. That'll start next week, and your calls and texts will close out the show. It's all coming up on Tuesday's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast, March 7th, 2023.
Just win. Just win. Just win. Just win.
The autumn wind is a raider, pillaging just for fun. He'll knock you round and upside down and laugh when he's conquered and won. And won. And won. And won. And won.
And welcome in, Raider Nation, to another edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen each and every day. Remember, you can find the Locked On Raider podcast free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. My man Ari continues to make sure we're up on YouTube each and every day. We definitely appreciate his efforts. You can check him out on Twitter at Ari Produces. And if you like what we're doing on YouTube, give it a subscribe, give it a like, give it a thumbs up, give it a thumbs down, whatever the case may be. Just let Ari know that you appreciate his efforts on the daily. A lot to get to on today's show, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. The Raiders made it official with running back Josh Jacobs, officially hitting him with the franchise tag. Something we talked about on Monday's show, not a surprise. They had till 1 o'clock Pacific time today to make sure that happens, so knew it was going to happen sooner rather than later unless they came up with a long-term deal. So that didn't happen. Hit him with the franchise tag. It's worth $10 million. It does not stop them from trying to get a long-term deal done. They have till the middle of July, about July 17th, so there's plenty of time to still work on a long-term deal. It's just a placeholder. It just makes sure that Josh Jacobs is a member of the Silver and Black in 2023. I had people hit me up and say, is it the exclusive franchise tag or the non-exclusive? It's the non-exclusive. Again, worth $10 million. The exclusive tag would be worth more, and it would make sure that Josh Jacobs couldn't talk to any other team. But Raider Nation, let's be realistic about the situation. We know how undervalued the running back position is across the NFL. The non-exclusive tag, if a team decides to make a move and trade for running back Josh Jacobs, they would have to give up 2 first-round draft picks. And what I mean by that is if a team says, maybe the Bills, like someone pointed out to me, the Bills would be the team to do it. The Bills need a running back, and they think that Josh Jacobs will put him over the top. So they sign him to a deal, and the Raiders don't match it. The Raiders would get 2 first-round draft picks in return. I'm sorry to say I'm a big Josh Jacobs fan, but the Raiders would take that every day of the week and twice on Sunday. If they can get 2 first-round picks for running back Josh Jacobs, they would do it. Again, I don't want them to do it, but they would do it. So they're not going to sit there and hold on to him that much if that kind of draft capital is out there. And there's no team in the league, in my opinion, that would be willing to give up 2 first-round draft picks for a running back. It's just not going to happen. So, again, I do feel like Josh Jacobs will be with the Raiders in 2023. I'm hoping that they get a long-term deal done, something front-loaded, maybe a 4-year deal that really is basically a 2-year deal, but he deserves a little bit of a nice boost in the contract, especially after what he was able to do in 2022. But, again, we all know it's a business, and that they're not going to just throw stupid money at a guy because he is a running back, and we know the undervalue that the running back position holds in the NFL. So Josh Jacobs, $10.9 million. The Raiders had till 1 o'clock this afternoon to go ahead and place that franchise tag on him, and that, in fact, they did. Also on Monday, we found out that Derek Carr officially was signing with the Saints, and that's fine. 4-year, $150 million deal, and we all know that those contracts are really funny money, and that's not really what it is. A lot of people were tweeting out, oh, my gosh, look at the crazy money that Derek Carr got. It's not really that money. It's really kind of funny money. So when you look at the contract, when it really breaks down, it's essentially really a 3-year, $100 million deal with a $50 million salary for 2026. That'll push the average from $33.3 million to $37.5 million, and the Saints can escape the contract after 2 years. If you want to read up a little bit more on it, go to Pro Football Talk, Mike Florio and company. They really put a good breakdown on it. So it basically goes like this. Signing bonus, $28.5 million. 2023 base salary, $1.5 million, fully guaranteed. 2024 base salary, $30 million, fully guaranteed. 2025 compensation, $40 million, guaranteed for injury at signing. Of that amount, $10 million becomes fully guaranteed in 2024, and the remainder becomes fully guaranteed in 2025. The payments are in the form of a 90-man offseason roster bonus in the amount of $10 million and a $30 million base salary. Then in 2026, the base salary is $50 million, which is non-guaranteed. So it's technically a 4-year, $150 million deal. It's at best a 3-year, $100 million deal. And the 4th year is a device aimed simply at driving the average from $33.3 million to $37.5 million, since he was looking for at least $35 million per year. So that's basically the ego number that the agent puts in there so they can get what they're looking like they're trying to get. The contract could be as short as 2 years and $70 million, with the final $10 million being subject to offset in 2025. But I wish Derek Carr the best. I always thought the Saints was a good landing spot for him, reuniting with Dennis Allen, playing inside a dome. There's good weapons there. There's a nice defense there. There's a good run game there. I think it's a good situation. Plus, the division is not a juggernaut as of right now. So I wish him the best. I don't have any ill will towards him. I think he's going to go out there and do the very best he can, and that's all you can do. He got a nice little compensation package, and again, he's familiar with Dennis Allen, so it should be all good on the Derek Carr front moving forward. And now for the Raiders, I mean, they've already officially turned the page, but for Raider Nation, it's time to turn the page and officially look forward to the next quarterback of the Silver and Black. I also wanted to talk about Geno Smith, as the news came down on Monday that he has re-signed his deal with the Seattle Seahawks. He was a free agent. He was going to be out there available, and I don't think he's a guy that the Raiders would have been interested in, but did think there was going to be a couple teams out there interested in Geno's services. He signs a 3-year deal worth a $105 million contract with $52 million in his first year. My man Jordan Schultz from The Score, he actually reported that first, and it's crazy because Geno hasn't made that kind of money, that $52 million in the first year. He hasn't made that kind of money in his whole career in the NFL. He puts together one season after taking over for Russell Wilson after he got traded to the Denver Broncos, guides the Seahawks to the playoffs, and he cashes in. Shout out to Geno Smith. I'm not mad at him. 3 years, $105 million contract. That's not bad. Plus $52 million in the first year. That's a good little bag for a guy who got it done in 1 year. And you look at guys like Daniel Jones with the Giants who are looking for $45 million a year. That's not something he deserves. But a contract like that Geno just signed, 3 years, $105 million, that's a good deal for a guy that's only done it for 1 year throughout the course of his career. And he stays in Seattle somewhere he's comfortable. But what he does is takes another veteran quarterback off the books. Geno's off the books. Derek Carr's off the books. Not that the Raiders were going to bring Derek Carr back, but still, just knowing that the veteran pool has just gotten a little bit less, now you really only have Jimmy G out there, Baker Mayfield, Jarrett Stidham, which obviously most likely he'll re-sign with the Raiders, and then Aaron Rodgers, who's not a free agent. You'd have to trade for him. But now teams that are desperate, like the Jets, teams like the Panthers, other teams, they might have to up the ante, and really, like, Jimmy G might get paid some stupid money now because teams are desperate for his services. What are the Jets going to do? One, they're going to go all in on Aaron Rodgers, but what if they don't get Aaron Rodgers? Then they're going to go all in on Jimmy G, and they might have to overpay in a major way for Jimmy G. Baker Mayfield, he'll probably benefit from this. Jarrett Stidham even could benefit with it from the Raiders just because, well, supply and demand. Every team needs a quarterback, and there's not a whole lot of veterans out there available. And depending on how you feel about the rookie class and what your expectations are, you might not be willing to start one right away. Final little nugget I have for you for segment number 1 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast, kind of news and notes around the NFL. How about the Bears sitting there at number 1? Peter King, the great Peter King, Monday morning quarterback, he put out his piece, and part of it said that the Bears have made the decision to keep Justin Fields as their quarterback and will be trading the number 1 overall pick in the 2023 draft. He said that he spoke to Ryan Poles at the scouting combine, and it's funny, when I was sitting there at the scouting combine, I had an ESPN Chicago station sitting right behind me, and Ryan Poles was literally sitting right there at the table talking to him about the upcoming draft. So Peter King goes on to say it's clear he's not trading Fields and he's not picking a quarterback high in this draft. So there you go. Who knows how the draft order is going to go? I expect the Colts to be players to move up. I expect potentially the Texans to be players to move up. I think the Raiders could be players to move up, but not all the way up to number 1. So there you go. Be on the lookout for who could potentially move up to number 1 to get their quarterback that they want. Maybe the Panthers at 9. That'd take a lot of draft capital to get there, but it's something that I could see them potentially doing. That's all I got for you for segment number 1 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast, kind of news and notes around the league. Coming up in segment number 2, we got this exercise that we're doing with the Locked On Podcast Network, talking about team needs, 3 team needs. So I want to break it down, and I want to share what I had to say and bring it to the podcast and let you chime in on it on the Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line at 707-654-4693. That's coming up in segment number 2. Before I get to that, though, I do want to tell you about FanDuel, and it's down the stretch now when it comes to the NBA. Teams are jockeying for their playoff position. It's the perfect time to download FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. New customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. All you got to do is download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores, even how many threes are hit in a game. Plus, FanDuel lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. Don't miss a chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn about more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, Raider Nation, here we go. Segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Want to talk about the Raiders team needs. And why I want to talk about the Raiders team needs is this is something that we're doing on the Locked On Podcast Network all across the NFL channels. And excited about it. Always excited about the different projects that we put together. You know, right around the draft, we always do the mock draft where we have to go through and make our selections 1 through 32. And, you know, they put it together and it's a big show. They've been doing a lot of really good things since I've been part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And I think it's a lot of fun. It keeps the shows really fresh. It's entertaining, you know, and it's something that really makes it feel like a bigger network than it is. And let me make no mistake about it. The Locked On Podcast Network is a big network, but it just kind of, you know, says, hey, we're doing the stuff that the big boys are doing. And I think that there's a lot that should be out there taking note of what we're doing and trying to duplicate it because, well, again, I think the Locked On Podcast Network, they do it right. So they're doing a project right now that I took part in Monday night talking about team needs for all teams across the league. The 3 biggest needs in order: priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3. So looking at the Raiders, and as I put this thing together, I was only able to do a minute and a half. It had to be real quick because, again, if you're going to do all 32 teams, obviously it's going to take a little bit of time. So we don't have a long time to really go into big-time detail. So that's why I wanted to bring it to the podcast and share my thoughts with you and really expand my thoughts. And then on top of that, depending on what you think, you know, maybe you could hit me up with an idea and I could say, you know what, maybe that priority number 2 that I had really shouldn't be priority number 2. Maybe it should be priority number 4 and slide this in at priority number 2. Really help you or have you be a part of the project as well. Something that I've always prided myself in doing here on the podcast network is being able to bring you, involving you into the show and getting your thoughts. Because as we all know, Raider Nation is a very smart fan base, and I love to be able to share the airwaves with you each and every show. So here we go. Team needs 1 through 3. When it comes to the biggest priority, when it comes to a team need, we all know what the number 1 need is, and that's quarterback, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it. Ever since Derek Carr got sat down after that Pittsburgh Steelers game on Christmas Eve, we all knew that quarterback was going to be the biggest issue. So that was a no-brainer. But my thoughts on it were, okay, do the Raiders want to go with a veteran quarterback and have a rookie sit behind him, and then maybe Chase Garbers? Do they want to go with Jarrett Stidham with the rookie sitting behind him and maybe Chase Garbers? Do they want to have a veteran, an established veteran, and Jarrett Stidham and Chase Garbers? You know what I mean? There's different options out there. So that's really what the bigger question is, not what it is. We all know it's quarterback, but what kind of combination does Josh McDaniels, Dave Ziegler, Champ Kelly, what kind of combination do they want to put into the mix when it comes to the quarterback position? Veteran and a rookie, established veteran and Jarrett Stidham, or, you know, maybe even a rookie and a rookie, which I don't see that happening at all. But, you know, you never know. Maybe they draft a guy, maybe they get a CJ Stroud or a Bryce Young or someone they feel comfortable with starting day one, and they're able to bring that guy in, maybe have him compete with Jarrett Stidham, maybe even sign another guy later on in the draft, or maybe an undrafted free agent that could sit behind either him, whoever that is, or Chase Garbers. All I know is that Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler made it perfectly clear that there will be multiple arms added to the quarterback room this offseason, during the draft, whatever the case may be. It's not going to look like it looks right now. And currently under contract is only Chase Garbers. So we know there's going to be multiple arms added to that room. It's all about what they decide, how they decide to go about making those additions. Now, team need number 2 for me, I flipped it over on the defensive side of things. And look, there's plenty of needs on the defensive side of things, but I went into the trenches. I went with the defensive tackle position. I said, look, if you're playing against Patrick Mahomes twice, Justin Herbert twice, and Russell Wilson twice, not to mention all the other competition in the AFC, you've got to have a guy in the interior of that defensive line that can get after the quarterback. Like, he doesn't have to lead the team in sacks, but he's got to be a force. He's got to be able to help collapse that pocket so guys like Max Crosby and Chandler Jones could go to work and get more sacks. I mean, the Raiders have not been a dominant force when it comes to pressure on the quarterbacks, and that allows these guys that are too stinking good to stand back in the pocket and deliver that ball. Or if they get a little bit of pressure from the outside, they're able to step up into the pocket and escape the pressure and pick up first downs and pick up many yards. You cannot have that. You've got to have some kind of force. I would love to see a guy like Jerron Payne, who's a veteran, but he's been franchise tagged by the Washington Commanders, so that's $20 million. I don't see that happening. Most likely the Raiders will have to dip into the draft and go get their defensive tackle, and that's okay because there are defensive tackles you can get in the draft, and that could be your homegrown guy, and he could develop right alongside of Max Crosby and Chandler Jones. You can even get an edge rusher as well, but I'm really focusing on the defensive tackle position as the second priority for the Raiders. And third, I went with, and there's many different directions I could have gone here. I could have gone linebacker. I could have gone safety. I went with a lockdown corner. It has been a very long time since the Raiders have had a real deal shutdown corner. They've had guys that are good. They've had guys that are serviceable. They've had guys that have, probably exceeded our expectations, but they haven't been that lockdown guy. What I'm talking about is not only a guy that will make life difficult on a quarterback to complete passes, but also a guy who could affect the game as far as getting his hands on the ball and taking it the other way. The Raiders do not create enough turnovers. That's one of their biggest bugaboos. Their biggest pet peeves, or my biggest pet peeve with the team, is that they cannot find a way to create enough turnovers defensively. So they've got to have a guy that can stand out there on the island, have the confidence and the swagger to be able to run with whoever they line up against, but also almost dare the quarterback to throw the ball that way because they're confident enough to go get it. Right? If that's a Christian Gonzalez out of Oregon, if that's a Devin Witherspoon out of Illinois, if that's a Joey Porter Jr. out of Penn State, or if that's some kind of free agent that they want to bring in, if they want to get a Jalen Ramsey in a trade, I don't see that happening. But you know what I'm saying? It's got to be a guy that could be a dominant force. It's got to be a guy that's got the confidence to go out there and make plays. The Raiders not only need guys on defense, but they need playmakers. And they just don't have enough of that. They've got to get guys, even guys like Max Crosby and Chandler Jones, they got to get guys that can come up with strip sacks. They got to have guys that can create fumbles, punch the ball out. They've got to have corners that can get their hands on the ball and get interceptions and even take a couple to the house. They've just got to have that added to their arsenal, and the Raiders haven't had that in a very long time. So those are my three team needs for the Silver and Black. Team need number 1 is quarterback. Team need number 2, defensive tackle. Team need number 3, lockdown corner. What says you? What do you think? 707-654-4693. Of course, your calls and texts come up in segment number 3 of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Here we go, Raider Nation. Segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Your calls and texts straight off that Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line, 707-654-4693. Let's start things off with Raider Matt from the OC. He's calling to talk about the best case scenario when it comes to April's draft. Here he is, Raider Matt in the OC.
What's up, Q? This is Raider Matt calling from Orange County. Wanted to call in and just get your thoughts on the QB scenarios for the Raiders with the upcoming draft. I think after the Combine, the top choice that the Raiders have to have is C.J. Stroud. Bryce Young, there's no way he's available. Stroud may or may not be available at 7, and I think that's the guy they got to target. I don't think they should trade up to get him, just because there's a deep draft class with defense, especially the DBs, and we need quite a bit of help there. So I think that if CJ is not there at 7, best case scenario for the Raiders is we find a trade partner that we can trade back with, a couple picks, still be in like that top 20, and then be able to pick up maybe an additional second or an additional third, and we use that to trade back in the first round and pick up Hendon Hooker. I think you mentioned it on today's Monday morning podcast episode that Hendon Hooker may not sneak in the second round because of that 5th-year option, and I think that a lot of teams are probably going to think of that. And 5 years with a rookie salary with that 5th-year option would be a much better scenario for drafting a quarterback. So I think those are the 2 scenarios that I see the Raiders going after during the draft, and hopefully option A or option B works. But want to get your thoughts, Q, and see if that's somewhat realistic, and just see what your thoughts are on what the Raiders should do in the draft, especially at the quarterback position. And if the guy's not there, what should they do? Appreciate you, Q. Let me know your thoughts. Raider Matt, out.
Trade back, then trade back up to the end of the first round and get Hendon Hooker if you cannot get C.J. Stroud, if he's not available at number 7, and I don't think he's going to be available at number 7. Already was kind of pretty high on him, thinking that he was going to be a good quarterback, but after the performance he put on at the Combine on Saturday, I think he really solidified himself and maybe pushed Bryce Young to potentially be the first quarterback taken off the board. So I don't think he'll be there available at 7, but I do like your idea. Trade him back, collecting a few more draft picks, and then getting Hendon Hooker a little bit later, even if it's in the end of the first round, similar to what Baltimore did with Lamar Jackson, getting that 5th-year option. At some point, they've got to get the young quarterback, their quarterback of the future. The one thing I know, like I talked about in great detail on Monday's show, they're not going to force it. They're not just going to sit there and say, well, we need a quarterback, so we're going to go get this guy. We're not 100% sold on him, but we're going to get him anyway because we need a guy. That's what they're not going to do. So we'll see what happens. It should be really interesting, but, I don't think that they're going to trade up too high. If they go from 7 to maybe 4, I think 4 is probably the highest that they would go. Most likely, in all seriousness, it'll probably be number 5. but maybe they get to 4. I don't see him going to 3 or higher just because it costs too much to make that trade. So we'll see how it shakes out. But your idea of trading back and then trading back up to go ahead and get Hendon Hooker in the end of the first round, that 5th-year option, is not a bad idea at all. Thank you so much for that call. I do appreciate you. Next up, I got a text from North Texas Raider. Said, what up, Q? It's North Texas Raider. I hear a lot of chatter about Mark Davis being impulsive and impatient. I just don't see it. Reggie got 5 years, albeit with the last year being a bit of a lame duck. Del Rio got 3 years and was only fired because MD loves Gruden. Gruden and Mayock would still be here now if it wasn't for Gruden's mistake. Derek Carr lasted for years, longer than most owners would have allowed given the lack of success. I think building the Raiders to a perennial winner will take time and patience. I actually have faith that MD has both. Anyway, thanks for all that you do for the nation. North Texas Raider out. And, that's actually a good point that you bring up. I appreciate the text, by the way. That is a good point. He gave Gruden 10 years. And if it hadn't been for those emails, Gruden would still be the head coach of the Silver and Black regardless. He was gonna coach those years out unless he ultimately decided he wasn't going to coach anymore, right? Jack Del Rio was doing his thing. He did all right. Reggie McKenzie got some time. The thing about it is I know that Mark Davis knows you can't just keep changing staff after staff after staff after staff because that's just not going to be very good. And he did stick with Derek Carr for 9 seasons, and at some point, everyone made the decision to move on. Now, this staff has to go ahead and show, I believe, moving forward that they're getting better and that they're putting this thing together the right way. The one takeaway I had from Indianapolis when I was around both Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler, they're very confident in their job. They're not worried about their job status and their job security. They feel very comfortable where they're at. So I wouldn't be too worried about MD pulling the plug unless something terribly goes wrong this upcoming year. Thank you so much for that text, though. I do appreciate you. Next up, got a call from Barry from Baltimore. He's calling to talk about the 30-minute sit-down we were able to have last week with GM Dave Ziegler and what stood out to him about it the most. Here he is, Barry from Baltimore.
What's up, Q? This is Barry from Baltimore. Just calling in with a couple things. Always want to thank you, though, for bringing the content every day to Raider Nation. I appreciate all the interviews you've been posting on the pod and on the radio station. Some really good information, and that's one of the things I wanted to call in about. Just sitting there thinking about, I was actually listening to the radio that night when you guys were talking about the interview, when you replayed the interview with you, Vinny and Vic and all them, Deshaun, all them around the table, and with Ziegler. And I just, like I said, maybe I'm just, falling for the banana tailpipe, as you would say. But man, when Ziegler talks, it's just, I'm kind of believing it. I'm kind of feeling it. I don't know what it is. I felt that when I listened to the podcast with Bustin' the Boys. I just like what he's saying. But that one point, and you even highlighted it, is when he mentioned his relationship with Adams and how he thinks it's the closest he's ever been with a player. I mean, that right there speaks volume. I mean, we're not inside the locker room, so we don't know what happened, but, just bringing up, just for a second, the Carr situation, if it was really that bad, Adams being there, of course, being in the locker room, being a friend of Derek, and they're still friends, so, but, if it was as bad as some people think, then, these players would be upset. They'd be mad, and they wouldn't be able just to hide it, talking to the media or whatever. So Jacobs the same way, Crosby. So seems like the main dudes on the team are buying in. As a fan, I got to buy in too. So just my thoughts on that, man. And so I like the content. I like when you bring that stuff, man. Some good information. So I wanted to thank you on that. And then, everything surrounded the quarterback situation. So I can't stop thinking about it. I'm back and forth. Of course I would love Rodgers, but then the more I think about it is what giving up. This team has way too many holes to give up draft capital to get Rodgers for maybe a year or two. I love it, but I'm also thinking reality. I want to win now, but I also want to win. I want to be winning every year, not just 1 year. So that makes sense. So that's just my feelings. And, I guess I would prefer really at this point, draft a quarterback wherever you get him. If it's your guy, get him. Sign a veteran, bridge veteran. I'm not sold on Jimmy G-string like you. So I'm hoping that's not the case, but whoever it is, if you draft the quarterback, I'll be fine with that. So, and of course, defense. We need that defense to improve. So it's my thoughts, man. But hey, I appreciate it again. I'm out. Go Raiders.
Thank you for the call, my man. I appreciate you. And, yeah, I'm glad that you enjoyed that 30 minutes with Dave Ziegler. I thought it was really good, and I really did think that what Ziegler had to say is that he really does have a plan and is very comfortable and confident in his plan and has multiple versions of that plan, right? And he's not going to push. He's not going to force. He's not going to do anything impulsive and crazy just because he feels like he has to. He's going to stick with the plan. He's going to stay calm, cool, and collective and just let things play out the way they'll play out. Does that mean he's not willing to trade up? No, not at all. He's willing to trade up, but he's not willing to mortgage the future. Does that mean that he's not willing to bring in an Aaron Rodgers? No, that doesn't mean that, but he's also not willing to mortgage the future, right? I mean, that's the thing about it. He's willing to make moves as long as they make sense and they don't hurt the team for the long haul. Just like with Devontae Adams, and I asked him straight up about the Devontae Adams. He said, you know what? That was a good deal. You know, a first and a second round pick, and we were done with it. That made a lot of sense. So we pulled the trigger on it. If it hadn't made sense, we wouldn't have done it. So that's the one thing about Dave Ziegler, good or bad. He's going to stick to his principles. He's going to stay disciplined, and he's going to do what he believes he needs to do. And so that I did think was refreshing talking to him for about 30 minutes. Thank you so much for that call, Barry. It's good to hear from you. Next up, got a text from Raider Nick out the 808. Says, yo, Q, what it do? It's Raider Nick out the 808. I listened to all of Ziegler's interview with Bustle with the Boys and McDaniel's press conference on Tuesday, and I was a fan of bringing them in last year. But now when I listen to either one of them speak, sounds like a used car salesman trying to sell me a beater for a BMW price. Where is your trust level with them? And if it's high, why? They've proven nothing to Raider Nation as of yet. That's Raider Nick out the 808. Thank you for the text. And my confidence level with them is high. And maybe I'm buying the beater for a BMW price. I could be doing that. But I just believe from conversations with them that they have a plan. It sounds like they're very confident in their plan and that they're not going to set the Raiders as a franchise up for failure by going out of their way and doing something impulsive and selling the farm for it. For example, like the Carson Palmer trade. I'm a big fan of what Hugh Jackson was able to do with the Raiders, but I thought that was his biggest mistake, was giving up a first-round pick for Carson Palmer. Carson Palmer was sitting at home on his couch not playing, and he gave up a first-round pick in almost a panic-type move. Dave Ziegler and Josh McDaniels don't seem like those type of guys. I do believe that they know what they're doing. I do believe that they know what's best, and they're going to get it done. One example of that is they didn't try to overpay for J.C. Jackson when he was a free agent last year. They said, okay, we got a price for him. It exceeded the price. His price tag exceeded that. The Chargers were willing to give him more money, and they let him go to the Chargers. And look what happened. He had a terrible season, didn't play hardly any of it, ended injured, also had some off-the-field issues, and now the Chargers are stuck with him. They also didn't reach on a bunch of draft picks, even though they didn't have a first and a second. Dylan Parham was a starter. He could play multiple positions on that offensive line. Thayer Mumford, the seventh-round pick, they brought him in. He was able to contribute his rookie year. I know Zamir White didn't contribute a lot, but that's because Josh Jacobs wasn't going to let him on the field. Britton Brown was a seventh-round pick. They got a couple defensive guys they have to continue to develop. That's what Frank Okam was fired for, because he wasn't developing those guys. But I do think that a lot of the decisions they made, now I know that Dave Ziegler missed on Chandler Jones. He gave him that money, and it wasn't worth it. But for the most part, I think they did some really good things, right? They went and brought in Devontae Adams, thought that was a really good move. Traded for Jarrett Stidham, think that was a really good move. I mean, they made plays, they made moves. Thought Jakob Johnson was a good signing. I mean, there's some good things to like about what Dave Ziegler and company were able to do. Now give him a full draft and see what he's able to do. That's why I'm excited, and I do believe that they have a good plan in place, and they can really help turn this team around quick, fast, and hurry if they have a really solid draft and a really good free agency. So thank you so much for that text. I do appreciate you. Next up, and I just got a couple more, is Cyrezi from the Bay. He's calling to talk about the NFLPA report card and the survey that the Raiders and the team received, coming in third, but also talks about an area of that's not being spoke about enough. Here he is, Cyrezi from the Bay.
What up, Q? It's your boy Cyrezi from the Bay. Hey, congratulations to you, first off, for making it out to your first ever NFL Combine. I know that's a huge accomplishment, and it's, I think, one of the many steps that's probably on your master plan to getting where you want to be. So congrats on that. You know, I want to share some love and encouragement to you there, man. And the reason I'm calling today, though, is because I think there's something that's just not being talked about enough, and it's that NFLPA survey that that the NFL did, the report card that all the different teams got, and how the Raiders got, third place, which is great. And that was a good story that makes for good PR and so on and so forth. But I think there's a bigger story here that's just not being talked about. And that's the fact that the Raiders didn't get first place on this. And it's about what actually held the Raiders back from getting first place. And I was really disappointed to find out that what was holding them back was the grades for the coaching staff. Because for all the good grades that the team got for the facilities and the stadium and even the treatment of families and all that cool stuff, they ranked dead last on the coaching staff. In other words, of all the 32 teams, the Raiders players ranked their coaches or graded their coaches lower than all the other players and all the other teams did. And that speaks volumes. And in fact, if you actually read the detail, it talks about how their complaints were about how McDaniels was less likely to listen to his players than other coaches, that they held them for longer hours, and they even pointed out that longer hours don't correlate to winning. In fact, it's 7 of the 8 players or teams that or coaching staffs that made the most efficient use of their players' times went to the playoffs. And I think this is something that it's a little bit disturbing, especially given Josh McDaniels' background and his history with everything that went on in Denver. Some things that have been said, even going back to like when Ryan Clark was at the Raiders training camp and somebody asked him like, hey, what did you really think about the Raiders training camp? And he said, yeah, it was just too uptight. He said the whole atmosphere was just too uptight and he didn't like it. And you go back to Derek Carr's statements in that emotional press conference about how guys were having to practice and all the things they were having to do to their bodies, and this is the result. This is something I believe the Raiders have to address, and Mark Davis specifically has to address that, because you can have different types of personalities in different positions, but they have to set it up right. And right now, it just seems that Josh McDaniels is who he is. He's not a great leader and a motivator, and they got to find a way to fix that. So anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, man. I know it doesn't make for the greatest conversation, but I think it can't be ignored. All right, sorry.
Thank you for the call, my man. And yes, I saw the report on the coaching staff, and that is a concern. You're not wrong. That is definitely a concern. I don't know exactly how many players were surveyed when it comes to the Raiders players that voted the coaching staff 32nd. But, I mean, that just kind of does sound like, Josh McDaniels in their way. Even C.J. Stroud, when he was interviewed on Friday last week at the Scouting Combine, and Vinny asked him about meeting with Josh McDaniels and company, how it went, he said they're very stern. They love football, but they're very stern and very strict on what they do, and they're all about ball. And he said that he could appreciate that. So I think that Josh McDaniels comes from the school of coaching where it's a certain way, and he's not going to really change who he is. And sometimes that's going to work, and sometimes that's not. I think he's going to coach people really hard, and some players will really appreciate that, and others won't. The one thing I'll say is, from what I've heard from being in the locker room, Davante Adams is tight with Josh McDaniels. Davante Adams is tight with Dave Ziegler, and I think that that's important, right? Josh Jacobs has a good relationship with Josh McDaniels. Josh Jacobs has a good relationship with Dave Ziegler. So I do believe that, the guys that are key guys in the Raiders locker room are guys that do have a good relationship with the coaching staff, guys that love ball, guys that want to go out there and win. So I think that is good. But, Ryan Clark, you bring him up, and I had him on my radio show, and I asked him what he thought of training camp, and he did say that. He said, hey, the players weren't having fun, and that could be an issue. Look, I've never been in a professional locker room as far as a player goes. Ryan Clark has, so he knows what he's looking for where I don't. So maybe they do need to have more fun, but I just don't think Josh McDaniels is really going to do a whole lot of having fun. But for the most part, I feel like the players that I see in the locker room, the ones I talk to, and I know they're not going to tell the whole story, they pretty much don't have a problem with head coach Josh McDaniels and their coaching staff. But again, that's just what we see as the media when we get to go in there and talk to them. So thank you so much for that call. I do appreciate you. We'll close things out with a text from Fletcher from the 603. He says, hey, Q, it's Fletcher from the 603. I can't wait for the action coming up over the next couple of weeks. Let's talk Raiders quarterbacks. But first, just a few quick numbers, 38-35. One of, if not the best defenses in the league, couldn't do squat against an elite quarterback. The Eagles proved it once again. The old defense wins championships is no longer the case. And the Raiders, and I think they'll need to understand this. Don't panic about our defense. Go get the best quarterback in the draft, and to me, that's C.J. Stroud. You have to compete with the best. If it costs them 3 first-round picks, then give up those picks. Move up to number 1 and don't settle for a quarterback. We've got plenty of money the next 2 years to plug in on defense and free agency. Plenty of picks that are not first-rounders to do the same. As always, Q, keep up the great work you do. Your ability to be a fan of this team and be able to walk the line of not drinking the Kool-Aid but also not harping on the negatives is truly appreciated. That's Fletcher from the 603. Thanks for the text. I appreciate you. And yeah, I don't have any problem with the Raiders going against C.J. Stroud. I don't think that Dave Ziegler is going to be willing to give up 3 first-round picks and trade up to, say, 1. 7-1 is a big haul. The Bears are clearly interested in trading out of number 1. But I do think that he'd be willing to trade up and go get their guy. If their guy happens to be C.J. Stroud or whoever it is, I think he'd be willing to trade up to maybe 3 or maybe 4. I think 3, like I said earlier, is a little rich. I think that he'd be willing to trade up to 4. But think about it like this: if the Bears trade out of 1 to 4 with the Colts go out and get their quarterback. If it's Bryce Young, if it's Will Levis, if it's C.J. Stroud, if it's Anthony Richardson, they get their guy. So say C.J. Stroud is still on the board. Sitting there at number 2 is Houston Texans. That's a team that you'd have to really worry about, right? Because they're probably going to take the other quarterback, whoever the Colts don't take. But if they get if C.J. Stroud or somebody gets past second that the Raiders believe in, then they have a chance. The Cardinals at 3 most likely are going to take a defensive player because they have Kyler Murray. At 4, you would have Chicago because they traded with the Colts. They're not taking a quarterback, so then they take a defensive player. So at 5, then maybe the Raiders would have to trade up to 5 to get their quarterback if their guy was still on the board. I think the biggest question will be 1 and 2. Whoever's sitting there at 1, if the Colts happen to trade up, like I think they will, and then the Texans sitting there at number 2, that could be Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud. That could be C.J. Stroud, Bryce Young. That could be Will Levis, C.J. Stroud, Will Levis, Bryce Young, whatever. It could be a combination, right? So 2 quarterbacks could be off the board within the first 5 picks, but that 5th pick is where the Raiders may have to trade up if their guy is still on the board. But thank you so much for the text. I do appreciate you. Should be an interesting few weeks, and of course, it'll be an interesting draft, but we'll know something when free agency hits, and of course, the tampering period kicks off next week. So thank you so much for that text. I do appreciate you. But Raider Nation, I do want to know your thoughts. 707-654-4693. I went a little long in the calls and text section because I want to clear them out. I want to know what you think the Raiders' top 3 team needs are in order. Team need number 1, team need number 2, and team need number 3. In the project that I did for the Locked On Podcast Network, I said cornerback, defensive tackle, and lockdown corner. I want to hear from you what you think. 707-654-4693. We'll share those thoughts on tomorrow's show. Plus, we'll have more news and notes, and we'll have plenty of conversation and calls and texts here on the Locked On Raiders podcast. So until then, Raider Nation, thanks so much for making the show your first listen each and every day. Remember, you can find the Locked On Raider podcast free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, thanks to my man Ari. So until tomorrow, Raider Nation, take care of yourself, take care of your family, love on your family. Most importantly, as always, just win, baby.